मेरा मन मेघ का संगी, उड़ता चले दिगंत की ओर। निस्सीम शून्य में श्रावण वर्षण संगीत में, रिम झिम रिम झिम रिम झिम। मेरा मन मेघ का संगी, उड़ता चले दिगंत की ओर। निस्सीम शून्य में श्रावण वर्षण संगीत में, रिम झिम रिम झिम रिम झिम। मेरा मन हंस बला का पंख से उड़ जाए, काचित काचित चकित ताड़ित आलोक में। मेरा मन हंस बला का पंख से उड़ जाए, काचित काचित चकित ताड़ित आलोक में। झन झन मंजिर बाजाए झंझा, रुद्र आनंद में कल 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 मंद्रे निर्झरिणी पुकारे प्रलयवहाने। मेरा मन मेघ का संगी, उड़ता चले दिगंत की ओर। निस्सीम शून्य में श्रावण वर्षण संगीत में, रिम झिम रिम झिम रिम झिम। हवा चले पूर्व समुंदर से, उछल छल छल तटिनी तरंग में। हवा चले पूर्व समुंदर से, उछल छल छल तटिनी तरंग में। मेरा मन धायुस मत्य प्रवाह में, ताल तमाल अरण्य में। मेरा मन धायुस मत्य प्रवाह में, ताल तमाल अरण्य में। क्षुब्ध सखा के कंपन में, मेरा मन मेघ का संगी, उड़ता चले दिगंत की ओर। निस्सीम शून्य में श्रावण वर्षण संगीत में, रिम झिम रिम झिम रिम झिम रिम झिम रिम झिम रिम झिम।
Namaste, my dear brothers and sisters. Nice to be with you once again today. This devotional song that you heard emphasized the mobile and volatile character of the mind, comparing it sometimes to the clouds and rain and sometimes to a swan which can fly. Of course, we all understand, and as Sri Krishna said, that the mind is very difficult to control because of its mobile character. But then this very same mind becomes our very powerful collaborator on the spiritual path. The topic today is carbohydrates and dietary fiber. It's a topic again about which many misconceptions exist, and there are people who take great pride in saying, I eat no carbs. Whether that is really true is also doubtful. But anyway, we'll take a little closer look at carbohydrates today. For that, I'll go to the PowerPoint presentation. full screen. Before I start, the love and blessings of the Mother in Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch. This course is a part of the 150th birth anniversary celebrations of Sri Aurobindo and the celebrations of the 75 years of India's independence. Before we turn to carbohydrates, a few preliminaries. The traditional functions of food have been considered to be to provide us energy and to build up the body, which is required for repair of wear and tear and for growth. When we say traditional functions, it implies that there are some non-traditional functions of food also. And those we shall come to a little in one of the subsequent sessions when we talk about functional foods and nutraceuticals and things like that. But in fact, it is not as new as it looks to think of functions of food other than just providing energy and contributing to repair of wear and tear and growth. And to some extent, these two functions are also interrelated because repair of wear and tear, and in case of children, also growth, requires building up new tissues of the type that we have, and that means synthesis of compounds, and that the synthesis of molecules like proteins and other such big molecules, starting with very small molecules like amino acids, also needs energy. And therefore, although some of the food may be used for providing energy as such, and some for building up the body for either repair or for growth, we measure all food in terms of energy. When we talk of the requirements, food requirements, we talk in terms of the calories. Calorie is a unit of energy. How many calories we should be taking in a day. And then the body takes care of the partition, which way to channelize that energy to providing energy as such for running around and other things, or for building up new tissues. About the non-traditional functions of food, things such as preventing disease and helping us recover from disease, these are things which are not really new, that existed in Ayurveda in a very big way. And the father of modern medicine, Hippocrates, also said, let food be thy medicine. So looking at functions of food other than just these two basic functions is not really new, but then modern science has started thinking of those relatively recently, and that's why this label of traditional functions of food. Now, why do we need energy? As we saw, we need energy for everything that the food does in the body, whether it is energy as such or for repair of wear and tear. And if we were to split it, one way of splitting the way the energy is used is for just staying alive. Because if a person is not running around but is lying down all the time, even then the person needs about half as much energy as the person would need otherwise in active life, which means we need considerable amount of energy for just staying alive. And some things are obvious, some of the functions for which we may use it are obvious, like breathing and beating of the heart, but then every cell in the body is working all the time in one way or the other, at least to maintain its environment healthy and to prevent sodium from outside the cell getting into the cell and keeping potassium within the cell. Now these are all also functions which are taking place all the time, and therefore just staying alive needs a considerable amount of energy. Say as a rule of the thumb, about 1,000 calories a day just for staying alive. Then we need energy for the physical work, and that's why the more active a person is physically, the more the energy requirements. A soldier would need much more than a person who is busy with desk work most of the time. One may say that one who is doing desk work is still doing mental work, but then mental work does not need additional energy, because the brain in any case is one of the more sort of energy consuming organs of the body. In terms of its weight, it consumes relatively more energy. And what happens is that when we are doing say mental work, the parts which are busy or engaged in that mental work would consume a little more energy, but then some other parts are not being used much at that time and their energy consumption would go down. And the result is that the overall energy consumption of the brain remains more or less constant irrespective of what we are doing. So we don't really take into account additional energy required for mental work. Then we require some energy merely for the digestion and utilization of the food that we take. So this is sort of a tax to be paid. If we have to eat, then we also have to make a provision for some energy which would be required for digesting and utilizing the food. And this is what is sometimes called the thermic effect of food, or the specific dynamic action, and so on. And certain types of nutrients need more energy for digestion and utilization. The last question that arises, what is the total amount of energy we need? Firstly, we don't have to know, strictly speaking, because if we were to know exactly the number of calories we should be taking, and then we were to calculate all the time we are eating how much energy this item will provide me and that item would provide me, firstly we will not be very accurate, and secondly the whole business of eating would get converted into a mathematical proposition, and eating will lose both its charm and the type of mindfulness which is really required for eating would also become impossible. But then the interesting thing is that nobody knows exactly how much energy a person needs, and there's only a roundabout way in which we can know it with some precision. The roundabout way is that if there's a certain amount of energy that keeps the person's body weight reasonably constant and normal, then that is the amount of energy the person needs. And if the person takes a lot more than that or a lot less than that, then the person will either gain weight or lose weight. Why I said a lot more? Because the body again has that resilience, that capacity to adapt. If we take a little more than we need, we will not put on weight, and if we take a little less, again the body will adapt to that. So there's a range of requirements for each individual, and for that we get some rough idea from the amount that keeps us more or less at the level of constant body weight. The traditional nutrients, again labeled traditional because now we know of a few hundred other chemicals which are required in very small amounts, which we call phytochemicals, which have functions like antioxidants, etc. But if we keep those out, the traditional nutrients are relatively few: carbohydrates, proteins, fats, vitamins, minerals, and water. Carbohydrates are in a way the Cinderella of nutrition. They do all the work, and yet they are looked down upon as a necessary evil, or something that Indians take a lot because of their tradition, but actually it's not good for us. Or sometimes that we take a lot of carbohydrate because of poverty. Carbohydrate containing foods are relatively less expensive than protein containing foods. Now these are all misconceptions. In fact, we do need carbohydrates, a lot of them, and there's nothing wrong with it. Now, how much energy do carbohydrates provide us? 4 calories per gram. Now that is something that unites all carbohydrates. And how much of carbohydrates do we eat? Quite a bit. A quantity that provides us about 70% of our daily energy requirements. And why do we eat that much? Because it is traditional in India to eat the type of foods which provide that much energy through carbohydrates, and there is nothing wrong with it. And how much should we eat? We should eat the amount that we are accustomed to eating, partly because we need that much. It is there's nothing wrong with it, and also over thousands of years any population gets adapted to a certain type of diet, and therefore unless there's a strong reason, one should not deviate from a good quality traditional diet. Now, if we go to some calculation, how much carbohydrate should we eat? Say, as a round figure, we take a person's total energy requirement to be 2000 calories. Out of this, let 70% come from carbohydrates, which means about 1400 calories. Now, 1 gram of carbohydrate gives 4 calories, as we just saw, and therefore to get 1400 calories, one would need 350 grams of carbohydrate. So that is the amount of carbohydrate we need, 350 grams or so per day. What are the sources of carbohydrates? Cereals like wheat, rice and various millets, jowar, bajra, makai and so on, corn. Now these are all cereals. I have highlighted pulse in red, in the purple color, because there is a misconception that cereals have carbohydrates whereas pulses have only protein. Both these are in fact incorrect, as we shall see in a moment. Both cereals and pulses are major sources of carbohydrate in our diet. And apart from that, of course, carbohydrates in the form of starch are present in potatoes and bananas. And carbohydrate in another form as lactose is present in milk, and plain sugar, white sugar, is also a carbohydrate. Now these two circles show the approximate composition of a typical or average cereal and pulse. And you find that this is on a dry weight basis. And you find that the largest chunk in both these circles is taken up by carbohydrates. So while cereals have about 70% of their weight in the form of carbohydrates, pulses have also about 60%. And cereals also provide protein. About 10% of the weight of a cereal is protein. In case of pulses, it is 20%. So the pulses do have more protein than cereals, about double, but they still have a lot more carbohydrate than protein. So even pulses have a lot more carbohydrate than protein. And what about the remaining 20%? About 20%, the remaining 20% is water, even in a dry cereal or pulse. So that is the rough composition of a typical cereal and a typical pulse. So the first things we should get out of our mind is that pulses also have carbohydrate, and of course cereals also have protein, which we shall talk a little more in detail when we come to proteins in one of the subsequent sessions. While all carbohydrates provide 4 calories per gram, all carbohydrates are not alike. And one major comparison that we need is that the comparison between starch and sugar. Cereals, pulses, banana, potato, all these provide us carbohydrate in the form of starch. Whereas plain sugar, cane sugar, is also a carbohydrate, and it is of course what we call a simple carbohydrate, which means its molecule is rather small and as compared to that of starch. But it's not the bigness or the smallness of the molecule. There are plenty of other differences which sort of make this comparison important. When we take sugar, we get 100% carbohydrate. But that type of purity is in fact not desirable here. On the other hand, grains, cereals and pulses are a package deal. Along with carbohydrate, they provide us some protein, as we saw. They also provide us a certain minimum amount of fat, which is important because in fact, even if we add no other fat to our diet, this so-called invisible fat which is there in grains and vegetables and fruits will be enough to give us the minimum amount of fat of the type that we need. And therefore, strictly speaking, the additional butter and oil and ghee that we add to the diet is not, strictly speaking, necessary. It may be acceptable, but it is not necessary. So grains are a package deal. They provide us carbohydrate, protein, a certain minimum amount of fat, and also dietary fiber, which we shall talk about, provided we don't refine them too much, and they provide also quite a bit of vitamins and minerals. So they are a package deal, and we need all those other nutrients, and therefore without making any additional effort from these grains we can get all these nutrients apart from carbohydrate. On the other hand, sugar is 100% carbohydrate. Secondly, if we take sugar or foods that have large amounts of sugar like sweets and ice cream and cake and so on, there's a strong possibility of overeating, because on one hand, sugar enters the food surreptitiously. Without making much difference to the weight or volume of the food, it makes it more palatable. So we don't realize that something has been added which will provide additional calories. And on the other hand, it becomes more palatable, which means we are likely to eat more of it than we would if that sugar had not entered stealthily into the food. The result is that becomes a double disaster. On one hand, the caloric content goes up because of the sugar, and on the other hand, we are likely to overeat because it has become more palatable. Then dental health. Dental hygiene is important, but the diet also has quite a bit to do with the health of the teeth, and carbohydrate containing foods, rather sugar containing foods, particularly those that stick between the gaps in the teeth, the junctions of the teeth and so on, wherever they can find a place in the mouth, like chocolate. It has a strong tendency to stick between the teeth. That type of foods, after we finish eating them, continue to stay there in the mouth, between the teeth, get fermented by the bacteria there in the mouth. We all have those germs. And this process of fermentation, which means the food getting utilized by the germs, produces acid, and this acid then starts eating into the enamel of the teeth, eventually leading to cavities. So dental health is strongly related to both diet and hygiene, and certainly that doesn't mean that we will for this reason stop having sugar altogether, but if we are more conscious of it as a matter of routine, what one can do is to rinse the mouth thoroughly after the meal. After the meal means as soon as possible after the meal, preferably immediately after the meal, because even 5 minutes are enough for the process of fermentation to start and do some perceptible damage to the teeth. Then the impact on blood sugar. When we eat something, it gets digested, and one of the major products of digestion of carbohydrates is glucose. Glucose is a type of sugar, and that enters the blood. From the intestines, it moves into the bloodstream, and therefore the blood sugar goes up. Blood sugar we use more or less as a synonym, as a simple synonym instead of blood glucose, because glucose becomes more of a technical term, but blood sugar essentially means blood glucose. And let's see how the behavior of how sort of the body behaves when we consume starch as compared to sugar. That's what we are trying to compare starch with sugar. Now, this is what we call a typical glucose tolerance test, which some of you might have undergone. The person comes for the test after an overnight fast. Why this is important, we shall see. This we'll refer to repeatedly, because this is a very important concept, and is important for those who are healthy to prevent diabetes, as important for those who have diabetes to keep their diabetes under check with a sensible diet. So for both these things, it's important to understand this curve. So the person comes after an overnight fast. Let's say he had an early dinner, he comes early in the morning fasting, and then he's given some glucose to drink, say 50 grams of glucose. Now, glucose is something which does not require any digestion. So when a person takes this glucose containing drink, within a few minutes it starts crossing the intestinal barrier and enters the blood, and the level starts going up, and the peak is generally reached at about half an hour. So you get the report fasting level and PP level fasting level was the fasting level, and PP stands for postprandial, that is after eating. So how much was the level at half an hour, and sometimes you get also 2-hour postprandial level. So PP is postprandial. Now the rate at which it goes up in fact is not as fast as it could be, because as soon as it starts getting into the blood, there are mechanisms that kick in which in fact don't let it go up as much as it otherwise would. And that mechanism principle is insulin, and insulin ensures that it will not go up very high in two ways. Firstly, it shifts the metabolism. You see, the body can use carbohydrate, that is glucose, for energy, and it can also use fat, and to some extent it can also use protein. But most of the time in a healthy person eating a sensible diet, the body gets its energy either from glucose or from fats. So immediately after a meal, insulin is released because glucose gets into the blood, and this insulin shifts the metabolism from fat utilization to glucose utilization. So the person starts utilizing now energy for starts utilizing glucose for getting energy instead of fat, which he might have been using when he was fasting overnight. The second thing that insulin does is to increase the synthesis or manufacturing of fats in the body. So this will then serve as storage later on, which can be released when the person is fasting or between meals. So insulin uses up this glucose, helps in using up this glucose by shifting the metabolism towards utilization of glucose rather than fats for getting energy, and it also uses up some of this carbohydrate for manufacturing fats. And that's why the level doesn't go up as much as it would in the absence of insulin. And then as one would expect, gradually the level starts coming down, insulin starts switching itself off, and by about 2 hours the person has reached more or less the fasting level. Now, one indication of how the person has tolerated this glucose, that's why this is called the glucose tolerance curve, could come from the half an hour level, and whether it has come back to nearly the normal level by 2 hours. But a more accurate indication of how well the person has tolerated this glucose is this AUC, or area under the curve, the area that has been marked with these slanting lines. And this, you can see, is the area only above the fasting level. So strictly speaking, it's called the incremental area under the curve. Incremental means the increment that in the blood sugar that the person had over and above the fasting level. So this incremental area under the curve is the best indicator of how well the person tolerated the glucose, tolerated in terms of not letting the blood glucose go up very high, how good was his insulin response. So this is what the glucose tolerance curve is about, and this is one of the best ways to diagnose whether a person has diabetes or is in borderline diabetic, which is called impaired glucose tolerance, or is healthy. Now let's see what happens to this curve if a person, instead of taking 50 grams of glucose, takes 50 grams of sugar, or takes 50 grams of carbohydrate in the form of either white rice or brown rice. Now this is the curve after the person has taken 50 grams of sugar, and this is very similar to the curve after taking 50 grams of glucose. Now if the person takes rice, which means instead of sugar he's taking starch. So the major difference is that he's taking starch instead of sugar. You find that the peak doesn't go that much. Peak is much lower. And why this is good for prevention and treatment of diabetes, one can intuitively understand, because you are not straining that mechanism, that release of insulin which will keep it under check to that extent. You are releasing glucose slowly into the blood. And if instead of white rice the person takes brown rice, you find that the rise in the glucose is much slower. The peak may be reached not at half an hour but a little later, and then it comes down. Now the difference between 1 and 2 is partly because of rice having starch instead of sugar, and partly also because it has some protein, and the protein also helps in keeping this blood glucose down, and also because it has maybe a minimal amount of fiber. But then the fiber is much more in the brown rice, and therefore it is this additional fiber that makes this release of glucose from the intestine much slower and the tolerance much better. So we find that all carbohydrates are not alike, and in every respect we found that the starch is in fact better than sugar. And now we'll go to another comparison, refined versus unrefined cereals and pulses. That is, unrefined means those in which the seed coat is intact. We eat them as nature provides us. Whereas refined means we remove the seed coat, and one of the main thing that we lose is dietary fiber. But then along with that, in refined grains we also lose some vitamins and minerals, because vitamins and minerals are more concentrated in the seed coat than in the interior of the grain. But our focus will be on dietary fiber rather than the vitamins and minerals that we lose in the process of refining. So now we turn to dietary fiber. Now, what is dietary fiber? Dietary fiber is found in plant foods. That can be taken almost as an axiomatic statement. Animal foods do not have dietary fiber. The second important characteristic of dietary fiber is that it is not digested by endogenous enzymes of the human gastrointestinal tract. Now, this may sound a little too technical, but I'll explain it and why this is necessary. If you would just say that dietary fiber is not digested, loosely speaking, it would be right. But then why all that addition? Because in the intestine, we have not only enzymes which our own intestinal tract produces, but also enzymes which are produced by the bacteria residing in the intestinal tract. And all of us have plenty of bacteria, and that is completely normal. In fact, it is desirable. So those bacteria which reside in the intestinal tract, they also produce enzymes which can digest certain foods, but including some types of dietary fiber. So the fiber, some types of fiber may be digested by the enzymes produced by the bacteria in the gut. So when we say that something is not digestible and therefore it is dietary fiber, what we mean is that it is not digested by those enzymes which are produced by the stomach and intestine, by the human gastrointestinal tract. Whereas the bacteria residing in the human gastrointestinal tract may be able to digest certain types of fiber. The prototype of dietary fiber is cellulose, which is not even digested by the enzymes present in the gut. It is a close cousin of starch, chemically speaking, but that little difference makes so much difference that starch gets digested, whereas cellulose does not. It's the principal constituent of the cell walls, the plants, and it's also in the outer seed coat of the grains. Now, going a little further into the types of dietary fiber, we sometimes classify them into water insoluble and water soluble types of dietary fiber. So you can see that chemically speaking, it's a heterogeneous group of chemicals, and the only thing that unites them is the fact that they are all found in plants and that they are not digested by the endogenous enzymes of the gut. Now, water insoluble fiber has two major components, cellulose and lignin, and neither of these is digested by the bacteria in the gut. Lignin, is the type of thing that provides the grittiness to things like pear. That grittiness is because of lignin. That and cellulose are the tough types of fiber which don't dissolve in water, which cannot be digested by bacteria, and they do not get fermented. And if something does not get digested, naturally it will stay in the gut, and if it stays in the gut, it will add to the volume of the contents of the gut, and that is how it will keep the gut moving, because we need a certain amount of volume to keep the gut moving. So that's how fiber prevents constipation. Then we have another type of fiber, water soluble fiber, pectin, gums, mucilages. Now these are the types of fiber which are found, say, in apple, pectin, and that's what helps us make jams. And then we have these gums and mucilages in things like bhindi, lady's finger. That's what makes it sticky. And then we have raffinose group of oligosaccharides which are found in things like rajma and chana. They get fermented, they're water soluble, they get fermented, and that's what gives us flatulence, because when the bacteria ferment these compounds, they produce gas, and that's what gives flatulence. Now these water soluble types of fiber absorb water, which means they soak up water and swell. And that we have all seen, if you have ever soaked a spoonful of isabgol in water, you find it swells up. That is again predominantly water-soluble fiber. So that's how it swells up, and that also will then add to the volume in the intestines, and not only add volume, it also makes the stool softer. So again, it prevents constipation. But then this group of these water-soluble types of fiber get digested by the bacteria. They get fermented, so they also produce gas. And that's why if you try to prevent constipation only by taking 2 spoons of isabgol every day, you might be able to keep constipation away, but then you start having a lot of lettuce. So there is a price to be paid. Secondly, because of this fermentation, the bulk of the stool goes up also because of the germs that this fiber is supporting. The population of these germs grows, and that's how this bacterial mass also then contributes to the bulk of the stool. So the way the two types of fiber are preventing constipation is different. The water-insoluble fiber just by staying back without getting digested or fermented. And the water-soluble by soaking water and swelling up, and by supporting the growth of bacteria, thereby increasing the bacterial mass in the stool. So they are both bulking agents. They can both prevent constipation, but in different ways. And fiber is not only there for preventing constipation, it also has metabolic effects. Metabolic effects in terms of keeping the blood glucose and blood cholesterol low, and that is predominantly the function of the water-soluble type of fiber. So we need fiber, and we need both types. And why this is important is because grains, particularly cereals, will provide us predominantly water-insoluble fiber, whereas the fruits and vegetables would provide us predominantly water-soluble fiber. So that's why we need both grains and fruits and vegetables, because they provide different types of fiber with somewhat distinct functions. Now, fiber became an important topic for study after 2 British physicians, one of whom you can see there, Dr. Dennis Burkitt, and another one we'll see in a moment. These British physicians who had studied medicine in England, they went to work in Africa. And they found that many of the diseases that they had seen were extremely common in England were hardly seen in Africa. And intuitively they thought this might be because of the coarse diet, not the highly refined type of diet, which these Africans were eating. And one of the major diseases was piles, and piles is not a simple disease, it has sequelae. If we strain at stool, if a person is constipated, and that repeated pressure leads to varicose veins. It shows up, piles and varicose veins. Gives piles, can give varicose veins in the legs, and fiber has metabolic effects. Fiber also has other indirect effects. It prevents overeating, so less of obesity, less of all the diseases associated with obesity like heart disease and diabetes. So they found that a whole cluster of diseases like constipation, piles, varicose veins, peptic ulcer, diabetes, and heart disease, these were all far less common in Africa than in England, and they attributed it to the diet. And Dennis Burkitt thought it was predominantly fiber that was responsible for it, and he came up with the fiber hypothesis, and he sort of built up a whole hypothesis how dietary fiber can prevent each of these lifestyle diseases. Another person who approached the same issue from another angle, again another British physician who went to work in Africa, Surgeon Captain T.L. Cleve. He said that it is too much of sugar that people in England eat that is responsible, and so he called his hypothesis the saccharine hypothesis, and he came up with a book, The Saccharine Disease. Now here the spelling of this saccharine is slightly different from the saccharine which you have in that artificial sweetener. So this saccharine refers to sugar, not that artificial sweetener. So he came up with this book and his hypothesis, and this just approaches it from another angle, because if the person is taking carbohydrate in the form of sugar rather than in the form of high fiber unrefined grains, then indirectly that also becomes responsible for the same set of diseases. So why do we want dietary fiber? We saw how it adds bulk to the stool, makes the stool softer, and has metabolic effects which prevent diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Now, what are the sources of dietary fiber? Unrefined cereals, unrefined pulses, and vegetables and fruits. And we saw why both these types of sources, grains and vegetables and fruits, are both important. And this is important to emphasize because a common misunderstanding is that if we take enough of fruits and vegetables, we'll get enough of fiber. Why they are not enough is for a variety of reasons. Not only that they have a different type of fiber, that is water soluble fiber, which has distinct functions, but also because the quantity of fiber in fruits and vegetables will be small, because fruits and vegetables are essentially more than 80% water. So if more than 80% of food is water, the scope for having any other nutrient is very small, and therefore they cannot have the amount of fiber which food grains can have. So the quantity of fiber per 100 gram of a fruit or vegetable will be naturally small, because out of those 100 grams, more than 80 grams is water. Secondly, we do not eat fruits and vegetables in the quantity that we eat food grains. So on one hand, the amount of fiber in the fruits and vegetables is less. On the other hand, we eat much less of the fruits and vegetables than of the food grains. So the result is that we'll get very little fiber from fruits and vegetables. I'm not saying we should not eat fruits and vegetables. That will come up later, why it's necessary in one of the subsequent sessions, why they are still important. But to depend upon fruits and vegetables for dietary fiber is unrealistic. What we can hope to get from them is some amount of water soluble fiber, and that also not only from them. We do get considerable amounts of water soluble fiber also from grains, particularly legumes or pulses, and also from millets. Some of the millets like barley and oats and those other grains in fact have more of water soluble fiber than wheat and rice, the two more commonly consumed cereals. And that's why we started talking in terms of multigrain these days. But again, the Ayurvedic physicians will tell you that this multigrain should be judicious. The combinations should be judicious. For example, barley would be good in summers, not in winters. On the other hand, bajra will be good in winters, not in summers. So you can have multiple variety of grains, but then judiciously combined. So vegetables and fruits are not really enough to provide us all the dietary fiber that we need. Now, we'll again turn to that curve, and this is for recapitulation. The person has given 50 grams of glucose, and this is the way the blood glucose goes up and comes down, and this is the area under the curve. Now, this is something which is forms the basis of calculating another index, which now is there all over popular press, the glycemic index. So how is the glycemic index actually calculated? For that, we give a reference food which pushes up the blood glucose quickly to a very high level. And this reference food has been changing, but currently, by and large, it is most people use 50 grams of glucose as the reference food. So at zero time, that is the beginning of the thing, a blood sample is taken and then the person is given 50 grams of glucose, and this is the curve we get. Now suppose we want to determine the glycemic index of food, say food number 1. Then on another day, we give the person not 50 grams of glucose, but enough of this food which would provide 50 grams of carbohydrate. So the equivalence is in terms of carbohydrate. 50 grams of glucose is 50 grams of carbohydrate. Food number 1 is also providing 50 grams of carbohydrate. We give that much of a food. And then see how the blood glucose behaves. And we can do the same with another food, say food 2. And then the glycemic index is calculated from the incremental area under the 2R curve when the test food, say food 1 or food 2 was given, divided by the area under the curve when the reference food was given, and this is multiplied by 100. Most of the time you'll find that the food gives a smaller area under the curve than glucose. And therefore most foods will have a glycemic index under 100, because you are multiplying it by 100 to get a sort of a percentage. Becomes a convenient figure to handle. So since the area under the curve for most foods is less than the area under the curve after giving 50 grams of glucose, the glycemic index of most foods will be less than 100. So this is how it is calculated. And you can see that in terms of the strain on the body, in terms of mechanisms which keep the blood glucose under check like insulin, those mechanisms will be much less under strain in case of food 2 than in case of food 1. So food 2 will have a much lower glycemic index, say maybe 30 or 40, whereas food 1 might have a glycemic index of 60 or 70. So that's how you get these glycemic indices of different foods. And this is an arbitrary sort of a classification that foods with a low glycemic index are those which have a glycemic index of less than 55, medium 55 to 69, and high more than 70. And in general, one can say that the whole grains have a lower glycemic index than refined grains, for understandable reason, because fiber does not get digested. On the other hand, it soaks water, forms a viscous mass. The result is that the digestion is slowed down, and the slower digestion means slower release of glucose into the blood, and the blood glucose therefore will not go up very high. So even if insulin is not involved here, this is more of a mechanical effect, you can say. This mechanical effect of slowing down the digestion, slowing down the movement of the food because of the food having become viscous from the stomach to the intestine. So all this slowing down the enzymes would have to break these cell walls down and penetrate deeper into the grain to get at the starch. So all those reasons have been given, but by and large these are mechanical reasons because of which whole grains have a lower glycemic index than refined grains in general. Then fermented foods like idli have a lower glycemic index than unfermented foods. Unripe banana has a lower glycemic index than ripe bananas. So that way ripe banana tastes sweet, but its glycemic index is higher. And interestingly, refrigerated food has a lower glycemic index than fresh food. That doesn't mean that one should advocate refrigeration of food or eating stale food for the sake of a lower glycemic index, but this is just a scientific fact to keep in mind. And also, why does that happen? That happens because when we refrigerate a food containing starch, this part of the starch gets converted into what is called resistant starch. Now this resistant starch does not get digested, and because of that, resistant starch behaves like dietary fiber, and that is why refrigerated food has a lower glycemic index. So if you keep potato or banana in the fridge, particularly potato, it has been seen more in the case of potato than anything else, but there are studies on other grains, food grains also. So food grains, potato, these things if you keep in the refrigerator for a day before reheating and eating them, some of the starch gets converted into resistant starch and brings down the glycemic index. So resistant starch behaves like dietary fiber. What type of dietary fiber? Like water soluble fiber, which means that it will get fermented in the intestine by the germs, and therefore this refrigerated food is also more likely to give flatulence. So if you take the same dal fresh, it will give less flatulence than if you take it the next day after keeping it in the fridge for one day and rewarming it. More likely to give more flatulence the next day, because resistant starch behaves like water soluble fiber. Now here are the glycemic indices of some foods, and as you can understand, these are only approximate because it depends upon a lot of factors, and these are just averages that I have given from one particular source. Different experiments done at different places on different people would give different results, and by and large, if something has to be published, then it would be done on the same person more than once and on a large number of people before the average is found out. So, and that average will not be the same in every experiment at every place, but this does give you some idea. Now what you'll see here is that I have given only wheat bread. I have not said whole wheat bread or white bread, because the difference between the glycemic index, interestingly, of whole wheat bread and white bread is not too much. Only a small difference, which just shows that the wheat has some characteristics, particularly when it is made into bread. It has certain characteristics which make it easily digestible, and therefore whether it is brown or whether it is white, glucose is still released more or less at the same rate. The additional fiber would help in other ways. Its metabolic effects will be still there, its prevention of constipation will be still there in whole wheat bread, but the release of glucose is not very different. Release of glucose seems to be slower when it is baked into a roti or a chapati than when it is made into a bread. Maybe the process of fermentation which the bread undergoes might have something to do with it, but And this is one of the findings. In case of rice, the difference is a little more marked. Brown rice has a lower glycemic index than white rice. Again, different types of rice could have different glycemic index because some would have more of what is called amylose, some would have more of amylopectin. Now, these are two different varieties of starch, and one will be digested faster than the other. So, but we do get some indication from this. Buckwheat is kuttu, the grain that is commonly eaten during the fasting season. That's a high fiber grain and has a distinctly lower glycemic index. Barley, again an extremely low glycemic index, perhaps partly because it has a considerable amount of gums and mucilages. Probably that's what keeps its glycemic index low, making the mass in the stomach more viscous and delaying the process of digestion of the starch. And in fact, there is a traditional sort of a roti made in Rajasthan in which they have, along with wheat, some barley and some black gram, that kala chana. And this has that combination has an extremely low glycemic index and is a rather healthy combination. Then French fries, you'll say that, well, this is potato. Potato has a high glycemic index, 78, considerably high. How is it that French fries have a lower glycemic index? French fries have a lower glycemic index because they contain fat. In general, you find that if you add anything to carbohydrate, the glycemic index goes down. If you add fat, the glycemic index goes down because fat delays gastric emptying, slows down the movement from the stomach to the intestine. So the digestion of the starch in the intestine will be slowed down because it is being delivered slowly there. If you add protein to starch, again the glycemic index goes down, and that is why there is one reason why the food grains like cereals and pulses have a lower glycemic index than sugar, because along with starch, which may be very well digested, they also have protein. So it is the fat in the French fries which has brought down the glycemic index. So does that mean therefore we can have plenty of French fries? No, because we don't have to forget that fats also provide 9 calories per gram. So we don't have to forget the energy content of French fries, and that is why we have to think of not having too much French fries either, even if the glycemic index is low. Cornflakes, easily digested, 81. Popcorn, more difficult to digest, 65. Honey, 61, because it doesn't have the same type of sugar as ordinary sugar. It has large amount of fructose, and fructose is there also in fruits. Fruit sugar is also considerable amount of fruit sugar is also fructose. Now the behavior of fructose is different from the behavior of glucose, and in a way it is helpful to the body, though some people would argue it's not helpful because it promotes the formation of fats in the body. Now what happens is that unlike glucose, fructose is picked up rapidly by the liver cells. As soon as it enters the blood, it's picked up by the liver cells, and the liver cells convert it either into glycogen, which is stored in the liver as a sort of storage material for later use, and liver also converts fructose into fats. They can also be used later. Now this conversion into fats is what frightens many people, but then so long as our total caloric intake remains within limits and we are not putting on weight, fat is there to be used, and these reserves are a physiological mechanism of providing us something to call back on when we are either not eating between meals, fasting, or undergoing a long period of food deprivation, because that has been a historical fact. People have not been getting, or animals don't get even now, an ensured supply of 4 meals a day punctually on time. That is a very recent thing in human history. Then chickpeas, again a very low glycemic index. Chickpeas is safed chana, and for that reason all types of chana are again recommended to people who have people with diabetes are generally advised to take those. Lentils, other pulses, 32. Soybean, 16, because of its high protein and fat content, relatively low carbohydrate content. Potato, 78. Banana, only 51. Apple, 36. Watermelon, 76. Now you'll say watermelon 70 is such a high glycemic index, but then it has so much of water. So to take 50 grams of glucose from watermelon will be extremely difficult, and therefore this glycemic index should not frighten you. Carrots, chocolate and ice cream, low glycemic index because of their high fat content. So as in case of French fries, don't forget the fat content and the caloric content. Then glycemic index of a few other foods, beet 69. Now all these broccoli, cabbage, lettuce, mushroom, onions, all 10. 10 to me looks like an arbitrary figure which has just been put because some rice will be there, it will not be. But you can't do a test on these because to provide 50 grams of carbohydrate from any of these, which is mostly water, they hardly have any carbohydrate, will be extremely difficult. Nobody will be able to eat the amount of broccoli or cabbage required to get 50 grams of glucose. You can't conduct an experiment to determine their glycemic index. Now this is an important slide. Why? Because there's something that has been passed on from generation to generation and repeated parrot fashion by almost every dietitian. They all tell the people who have diabetes, don't take grapes, mangoes and chiku because these are sweet fruits. But then you find that the glycemic index is around 50, whereas guava, which escapes this type of prohibition, has a glycemic index of about 80. So we find that many of these things are not really logical. Just because a fruit tastes sweet doesn't mean that its glycemic index will be high. Glycemic index can be still low because the amount of total carbohydrate that it has is very small, and you'll find it very difficult to get 50 grams of carbohydrate from any of these foods because the water content is generally more than 80%. Secondly, some of these fruits are sweet because of sugars other than the carbohydrates. They have non-carbohydrate, non-caloric sweeteners. Not saccharine, but in one respect similar to saccharine in the sense that they are sweet in taste but provide no calories. So non-calorie sweeteners are present also in fruits, and one of them is thaumatin. So there are chemicals which may make a fruit sweet without contributing to the sugar content. So its fruit just being sweet does not mean that it is harmful. So we've seen that glycemic index is affected by a large number of factors. One of them is the company the food has. Company in terms of dietary fiber, fat, protein, etc. And then thorough chewing. Thorough chewing itself slows down the process the rate at which one eats. So if you eat slowly, you digest slowly. So that itself has been found to bring down the glycemic index. So one more reason why we should eat food slowly and chew it thoroughly before we eat. Then mental peace. Again, mental peace itself helps in keeping the glycemic index of the food low because it reduces the background of those hormones which raise the blood sugar levels. Then refrigeration we saw, but then that is not something to be recommended for taking a low glycemic index meal. One more thing that we have to remember is that what matters is not the glycemic index of individual foods, but the glycemic index of the meal as a whole, because we don't eat individual foods, we eat a meal. And why this becomes important is because some people have this idea that if I have stopped eating sugar, then I have done everything that was necessary to either prevent or to treat diabetes. Firstly, the person has not done enough because there is a lot more involved than just stopping sugar. And the person has done something which was not strictly speaking necessary. Because if suppose the person has a mixed meal, and at the end of the meal the person takes a cup of tea which has 1 spoon of sugar. Now this 1 spoon of sugar will make only a very minute difference to the glycemic index of the meal as a whole. So that is why the person has probably not done the most important thing by giving up sugar. What matters even more than the glycemic index of the meal, or at least what also has to be kept in mind, is the total glycemic load, which means that the amount of carbohydrate that has got in, which means that the meal is important, but then how heavy the meal is, that is also important. If a person takes a low glycemic index meal, but then overeats, again the amount of carbohydrate that this person gets in can push the blood sugar level to high levels which may not be desirable, to levels which are high enough to be undesirable, which means that don't eat too much. That's also important. So this total focus on glycemic index can also be misleading. What matters more than the glycemic index of an individual food is the glycemic index of the meal as a whole, which means you can get away with a bit of mischief, a bit of sugar will not do any harm, so long as the total glycemic index remains low, glycemic load remains low, means the total amount that you have eaten is not very high. Now we come to a few questions, frequently asked questions. How much sugar do we need? Strictly speaking, we do not need sugar. People are sometimes surprised. थोड़ी सी तो चाहिए होगी, 5 grams, 10 grams, 20 grams, कुछ तो चाहिए. No, we do not need sugar at all, because sugar is a relatively recent invention. There were times when we did not have the technology for making sugar, and people still survived. Animals still survive without sugar. We do not need sugar. But we do not need sugar is not the same as saying that we should not take sugar at all. So I'm not recommending monasticism. Stop taking sugar. Don't be attached to sensory pleasures. Sugar is one of the sensory pleasures, so give it up from tomorrow. I'm not saying that. We do not need it, but we may take it. It is acceptable. What is the acceptable limit? The acceptable limit is about 10% of the energy intake. Now, how much is 10%? Say, suppose a person needs 2000 calories a day, 10% would be 200 calories. 200 calories from sugar would mean 50 grams of sugar. 4 calories per gram. 50 grams of sugar means 10 teaspoons of sugar. That's a lot, you'll see. Now, that is the upper limit. The less the better. But the upper limit is about 10 teaspoons a day for a person who needs 2000 calories a day. Now, you'll say that why this talk about it at all if up to 50 grams is allowed? We're talking about it because people do consume sometimes more than 100 grams a day. You'll say, how do they consume that? Plenty of cups of tea and coffee with sugar, some cold drinks which may have sugar, some cake and ice cream which may have sugar, dessert at the meals which may have sugar, and the total can come to more than 100 grams. So that is why this precaution is still in order. Now, what is the treatment for constipation? One can understand high fiber diet, why that would help. Fiber of both types, water soluble and water insoluble. Plenty of water, because that fiber also needs water for keeping the stool soft and voluminous. Physical activity, exercise, again that is important. And in fact, in yogic practices there are particular postures which are recommended for constipation, which would move around the contents of the abdomen a little more vigorously. Let go. Now this is psychological, because you see, sometimes the constipation has been linked to psychological factors, particularly not letting go. Not letting go, it requires a physical dimension, not letting go of the stool. So that's how constipation can come. So the more a person is mentally at peace, the less he is likely to be constipated. Then Ispagula husk or isabgol or psyllium, botanical name is psyllium. Now this is widely used, relatively harmless, but then as we saw that depending upon only this or any other similar formulation may mean more of flatulence. But one thing you might have seen which was not mentioned is laxatives. Why laxatives was not mentioned is but what the laxative does is to lead to a very vigorous movement of the large intestine so that it empties out a lot. The person is satisfied. Now I'm feeling relieved. I've passed a large motion or more than one motion, and the person feels relieved. But then that is not the extent to which we empty our large intestine every morning when we go for a normal stool. We empty out only a part of it. The laxative empties out much more than we do normally every morning. And the result is that after the person has taken this laxative and felt very relieved, next 2 or 3 days would be taken up for the intestine the large intestine to fill up again. And till it has filled up enough for the person to be able to expel the normal amount and still leave the rest behind, the person will not pass any stool. So the person may not pass any stool for the next 2 or 3 days after taking a laxative, just because of the fact that now the large intestine, which had been emptied to an abnormal extent, is now just getting filled up. And the person only feels more confirmed in his mind that I truly have a very bad constipation. See, yesterday I took a laxative, I passed a motion, now for 2 days again I have not passed. Now what one needs in that situation is patience. Secondly, what one needs is plenty of water and a high fiber diet, so that when after 2 or 3 days he does pass, the stool does not become very hard, because the intestine is filling up. But at the same time, leaving that in the intestine for a long time also means that the water will continue to get absorbed from it, and therefore it will keep getting harder. So the intestine may be full enough after 3 days, but then if he has not taken this precaution of plenty of water and the type of diet that will keep that stool soft, after 3 days he'll feel that now the tummy is full, but he'll still not be able to pass, because now the stool is very hard. It has stayed there for too long. So therefore, laxatives should be avoided as far as possible. What is the treatment for flatulence? Firstly, let me start saying that a certain minimum amount of flatulence is a normal bodily function, because we will take some fiber and some other foods which do get fermented in the large intestine. That's a part of our normal diet, a normal healthy diet, and these bacteria will produce some gas, and this gas will be passed as flatus. So a certain amount of flatus is a normal physiological function. It's only the excess that becomes bothersome. And here are some of the tips. More probably you'll get from the Ayurveda experts who will speak in this series. There are certain pulses or legumes or dals, such as kidney beans, chickpeas and black gram, which should be avoided. These cause more flatulence because they have those raffinose group of oligosaccharides, which we talk about, which get easily fermented. Then the best ones to take are moong and masoor. These are the ones are most easily digested and also have minimum tendency to give any flatulence. Then some spices like ginger, adrak, omam or ajwain, aniseed or saunf, asafoetida or hing. These are some of the spices that help control flatulence. Avoid milk and curd if they do not suit you, particularly milk. If a person has lactose intolerance, then this lactose would get fermented and give flatulence. So avoid milk and curd. They can also give flatulence. Curd has less lactose than milk. So some people who do not tolerate milk may be able to tolerate curd. Avoid high fat and non-vegetarian foods, because these also get fermented in the intestines and lead to flatulence. Now some self-assessment questions. So try and think of the answer before I reveal the answer to you. True or false? Cereals provide us only carbohydrates, whereas pulses provide us only proteins. By now, I think at least expect everybody to know the answer. Cereals provide us carbohydrates and some protein. Pulses also provide us plenty of carbohydrate and some protein, a little more than cereals, but pulses also provide a lot of carbohydrate. Dietary fiber is best obtained from supplements such as isabgol. No, that's not the best way to take fiber because of various reasons, and isabgol is the last resort. The better way to take fiber is through whole grains and fruits and vegetables. That is, eating food as it has been packed for us by nature. All carbohydrates are not alike in that they provide different amounts of energy. Now, here this could have made easily also a good assertion reason type of question. All carbohydrates are not alike. This part is true. The reason given is they provide different amounts of energy. The reason is false. They all provide 4 calories per gram. This is not the reason why they are not all alike. They are not alike because they have a different type of impact on the blood sugar, They have different impact on our dental health and so on. So those are the reasons why different types of carbohydrates are not alike. Carbohydrates are an important component of the diet, required but only in small amounts, a necessary evil in the Indian diet, found in cereals but not in pulses. Now, let's start from the bottom. Carbohydrates are found in cereals but not in pulses. This is not true. They are found both in cereals and pulses, and in considerable amount. Even pulses have 60% of the pulses by dry weight are carbohydrates. A necessary evil in the Indian diet? By no means. They are, in fact, science has gone full circle, and now the diet recommended is one with a pretty high carbohydrate content, very similar to the Indian diet, and therefore to eat a healthy diet is very easy for Indians because they are accustomed to it, still the traditional diet. And carbohydrates are required but only in small amounts. Again wrong, because they are required in a large quantity. And the last one is likely to be the right one, an important component of the diet. Yes, they are. So A is the right answer. Starch is better than sugar because starch is a bigger molecule. Starch is plentiful in our staple foods. Starch takes longer to digest. Starch is natural while sugar is artificial. Again, you can get from this 4 assertion reason type of questions. 4 reasons why starch may be better than sugar. All 4 are pretty plausible alternatives. But let's see which is the best one. Starch is better than sugar because starch is a bigger molecule. Well, that by itself should not bother us too much. We don't think in terms of the size of molecules when we think in terms of what may be healthier than something else. Starch is plentiful in our staple foods. Yes, we eat plenty of it. We don't eat that much sugar, but that by itself does not make starch better than sugar. Starch takes longer to digest. Yes, that is true. It takes longer to digest than sugar, and that's what makes its impact on blood sugar different from the impact of sugar. Starch is natural while sugar is artificial. That is to some extent true, but again that is not the reason. So the best alternative seems to be C. Starch takes longer to digest. The foods that would provide the largest amount of dietary fiber in an Indian diet are maida and white rice, whole wheat, atta and brown rice, pulses and nuts, fruits and vegetables. Now the focus here should be on largest amounts of dietary fiber. Maida and white rice we can easily rule out because maida is refined, highly refined wheat, and white rice again is polished rice, hardly any fiber left. Whole wheat, atta and brown rice, yes, they can be major sources of dietary fiber, both because they have plenty of this fiber and also because we eat them in large amounts. So if you have to take 350 grams of carbohydrate in a day, as we saw in the beginning, and much of it has to come from grains, and grains have about 60 to 70% carbohydrate, it would mean that we should be taking about half a kilo of grains, cereals plus pulses put together. And a reasonable ratio would be about 400 grams of cereals and 100 grams of pulses. So these 500 grams of grains will give us about 350 grams of carbohydrate. And along with that, if we take them in an unrefined form, they'll contribute, they'll be the best contributors, the biggest contributors to our dietary fiber intake. Pulses and nuts, yes, if the pulses are unrefined, they will contribute to fiber. Nuts also will contribute to fiber, but then the amount of pulses that we take are less than the cereals, which is also a good thing. We'll come to that when we talk about proteins. The ratio should be about 1:5. That is, 1 part of pulses, 5 parts of cereals. So we take less of pulses than cereals, and then these pulses have to be unrefined to contribute to the fiber intake. And nuts, of course, they have fiber, but then we don't take and cannot take and should not take too much of them. They are high fat foods. So apart from everything else, nuts, if one takes too much, will make us put on weight because of the caloric content. Fruits and vegetables, Again, we saw that because of their having more than 80% water, can't provide anything in large quantity. The scope for having any other nutrient, including fiber, becomes very small. And then we don't eat as much of fruits and vegetables as we eat the food grains. So B seems to be the best answer. The largest amounts of dietary fiber in an Indian diet can come from whole wheat atta and brown rice. Quite a bit of this material appears in the second chapter of this book, Eating Wisely and Well. The title of the chapter itself is Cinderella. And some more comes in this chapter, chapter 11, Too Sweet, which is the chapter on diabetes in this book, Back to Health Through Yoga. These are two reference books. Nutritive Value of Indian Foods has been the Bible of Indian nutritionists for the last 80 years. The first edition appeared sometime around 1940. It has been revised several times, but it continues to be a basic book which gives you the nutritive value of nearly 1000 Indian foods in detail, not only the carbohydrate, protein, fat and fiber content, etc., but also the breakup in terms of the type of fatty acids and the type of amino acids and the mineral content of each minute mineral like zinc and copper and molybdenum. All that you will find in this relatively small book of about 200-250 pages, full of those charts and tables, nutritive value of Indian foods. This is a simpler book which anybody can use. It's also a reference book, but more for the general public, Dietary Guidelines for Indians. And this book, realizing its importance for the public, has been made available by the National Institute of Nutrition, which is an ICMR institution. It has been made available on the net for free download. So you can get the PDF of this book by going to the net. Dietary Guidelines for Indians. And the big chart on glycemic indices that I showed was from this book. The glycemic indices of various foods. This is the ashram where I stay and work, and now that the COVID restrictions have been lifted, the ashram is open to all of you, and you're most welcome here. And for any questions or comments which might be there even after the session, please feel free to drop an email to yes@yesspirituality.com. Gratitude to the Mother and Sri Aurobindo for this program, initiating it, sustaining it, and bringing today's session to a conclusion. Thank you all for being there.
Namaste. Thank you very much for this very informative session. It has been informative at a very practical and down-to-earth level, useful for our day-to-day use and consumption. Thank you very much for educating us. Namaste.
There are two questions in the chat box. Is wheat better than rice for a diabetic?
Wheat by itself is not better than rice. The reason it is thought so is because wheat is rarely consumed completely refined. We take only partially refined wheat. Chapati and roti are generally made from partially refined wheat. It still has quite a bit of fiber present. Whereas rice is most commonly consumed as white polished rice, which hardly has any fiber. So that is one reason. The second probably reason is that people tend to take large volumes of rice, and therefore the total quantity of carbohydrate taken may be more. Whereas chapatis, people generally they are conscious of it, they may stop at 1 or 2 chapatis.
And is good better than refined sugar for a diabetic?
Yes, good would be a shade better because of the other nutrients it provides, but then the sugar content would still be there, and sugar will behave as sugar even if it is in the good. The same sugar, sucrose. But some other nutrients will be there, and that is what helps.
Good morning, Dr. Bijlani. I have a question. This is Madhuri. So, as a nutritionist for the longest time, the protocol for having sweets has always been to have them as mid meals rather than as desserts post a meal, because then it would contribute towards high glycemic load of that meal, because the meal essentially converts into glucose, and then if you're adding any kind of a sweetened dish after that, then the glycemic load exponentially increases. But because I'm constantly, I like to update my knowledge, and I like to read the latest research. The latest research which is coming up is also now saying that when sweets are eaten individually per se as mid meals, the blood glucose sugar spikes are much higher than when they are eaten as dessert. So how far is that true is number one, my question. And since when we look at majority of the things, in terms of dietary understanding, we are basically coming back to what our previous generations were doing, whether it's to do with the kind of oils, kachi ghani, cold pressed oils, or having millets in the plan. Now, in our age-old ancient culinary wisdom, again, there's been a concept of having a little bit of sugar or jaggery or some kind of a sweet after meal. So which of the two is true, since this is emerging research? So I don't really know how true it is.
For this, I would much rather turn to traditional knowledge than the recent research that you're talking about. Of course, I'll link it to recent research and modern scientific knowledge. The traditional Ayurvedic wisdom is that sweet should be consumed at the beginning of a meal, neither in the middle nor at the end. And from the scientific point of view, the sense that it makes is that after taking a sweet, one is likely to be full because it will push up the blood glucose relatively faster. And hypoglycemia, as you know, is one of the signals for hunger. So the person will feel satisfied, and therefore he is less likely to overeat. On the other hand, taken at the end of a meal as a dessert, it is generally an additional thing after the person is actually full. When the person feels full and you ask him, one more chapati, the person says no. A little more rice, no. How about ice cream? Yes, that I can take. So this is what we call, kritrim ichha, artificial desire. So this artificial desire is what makes the person overeat. And therefore, more important than the glycemic index of the meal as a whole is also the glycemic load. So the glycemic load goes up, and the impact on the blood glucose, whether it is taken in the beginning or the middle or the end, would depend perhaps on the meal as a whole rather than what time it is taken, if we take, say, the postprandial after the meal is over. But what is more important is the glycemic load, and that will become much more if the person takes it at the end of the meal, the sweet at the end of the meal, because that is likely to be over and above what the person actually wanted to eat or should have eaten.
So does that mean that sweets should be eaten either right in the beginning of the meal or as mid-meal then?
Either at the beginning is the best, and at the end, actually the tastes recommended are, in terms of traditional sort of Ayurvedic wisdom, katu, tiksha and kashaya, that is bitter, astringent and pungent tastes. And that is why you find that at the end of the meal, one of the common things that is served is things like saunf and so on.
Thank you, Dr. Bijlani.
If there's a craving for something sweet, does it not mean the body needs it, is asking for it?
Well, there's no strict relationship between what a person feels like eating and the needs of the body. This is clearly shown in case of salt requirements, or in case of, say, when a person is thirsty, the person does need water. Also, some of the cravings during pregnancy have been considered justified because that is what makes the woman eat more, which is what she needs during pregnancy. But to sort of link the craving for sweet with the needs of the body would be at least not supported by any proper logic or experiments. It could be an excuse for sort of taking what the person feels like taking. But having said that, uh, eating sweets is not a sin. I mean, that's what we have seen. Eat them in moderation, eat them insensibly, eat them as part of a meal so that the impact of the sweet on the total glycemic index will be low, and keeping in mind the total caloric content of the meal. So, keeping all these things in mind, taking a sweet in itself is not a sin. What is important to eat is in moderation and sensibly. And in fact, this one of the things which Sattvic people like is sweet things. That's what the Gita says. They have a taste for sweet things. And that also takes me in another direction. What type of sweet? Because strictly speaking, logically, the sweetness of a carrot or the sweetness of an apple is not really worse than the sweetness of a gulab jamun or a rasgulla. So they are both sweet. Which type of sweet one considers better than the other may be more the result of conditioning than any strict logic.
Good morning, Dr. Bijlani.
Good morning.
This is Soumya here. So I have a question. See, sometimes we develop lactose intolerance little later in life. It may not be right from childhood. So then what will happen if you're a vegetarian and then you are not going to take any dairy because it doesn't suit you? How do we replace that?
If a person does not tolerate milk, the person can take curd, or the person can't tolerate a full cup, the person can take half a cup of milk. So reduce the quantity either by taking less milk or taking curd instead of milk. But if it cannot be taken at all and the person is a vegetarian, then the most important thing to think about would be vitamin B12. And then the person can take a vitamin B12 supplement. Tablets are also available, so one doesn't have to take mega doses, one doesn't have to take an injection. Vitamin B12 tablets are available.
Okay, thank you.
There's another question. What are your thoughts on ragi, millets, and quiva?
Ragi is a high calcium food, and if I link it with the previous question, the person who can't take milk can perhaps get some of the calcium from from grains such as ragi. The millets again sort of have undeservedly fallen a little out of repute. It's time to revive them, and they are getting revived, because just to depend exclusively on wheat and rice is perhaps not doing us too much good. And there's also some evidence gradually coming up about the subtle type of harm that the wheat protein gluten could do even to people who may not be outright gluten sensitive. So whether that is true, I mean, one can't be sure about, but all the same, the problem with wheat may be gluten. The problem with rice, particularly refined rice, is again overeating and the other lifestyle diseases that go with putting on weight. Millets could probably take care of many of these things, along with that, of course, providing many other benefits, because when we talk of foods only in terms of the gross nutrients like carbohydrate, protein, fiber, and so on, what we are forgetting is the other chemical components which may be present in very small amounts, but which could also have some functions. And there, I mean, the larger variety will make more sure that we will get all the benefits from the various chemicals that have been packed into food. For example, in case of barley, as I was saying, that it has a very low glycemic index because it has those gums and mucilages. Now these are things, and then there are some such plants which have been found to have large amounts of chemicals which are similar to vitamin E. Now these are things which have been found in some of the millets rather than in the two grains that have become the most popular, that is wheat and rice.
Can we eat curd with salty food?
Yes, curd can be mixed with salt. Milk cannot be mixed with salt. Curd can be.
Okay. Oral supplementation of vitamin B12 is not better absorbed by gut as age advances.
Well, I mean, unless there is one is feels that the gut is not absorbing enough, uh, by and large, I mean, because even tablets which do not have mega doses have enough of that reserve. Because we need very little, we need just 2 or 3 micrograms or something of vitamin B12. So, even if a tablet has 50 micrograms, that has enough of reserve. Secondly, the absorption of vitamin B12 depends upon the intrinsic factor in the stomach. And fortunately, in India, intrinsic factor deficiency is extremely rare, if at all. So, by and large, I mean, we should be able to absorb enough vitamin B12 or even from a tablet.
And what are the benefits of sattu compared to other greens?
Is sattu buckwheat or something? I'm not sure. Is sattu the same as buckwheat or something else?
So sattu is roasted chana flour.
Roasted chana flour. Well, I mean, chana we saw is a low glycemic index food, and could have other sort of, as I was saying, all these foods may have some chemicals in very minute amounts, which could have a role because of which they have this reputation, but which we may not be aware of. So yes, kala chana is one of the good grains for a person with diabetes who wants to emphasize a low glycemic index.
And this last question, quinoa is in fashion these days. How good is it?
Well, I mean, in general, fashionable things you see keep coming and going. The really necessary things which are enough to give us a healthy diet, they have a staying power. So I don't really give lay much emphasis on these fads which keep coming and going. Every 10 years there'll be a new fad.
I think that will be all for the questions. We come to the end of today's session. Tomorrow we will have another practical session on Surya Namaskar. So thank you everyone. We end with the meditation music. See you all tomorrow.
Om